Today's talk is meant to be a little bit informal and a little bit exploratory. And I think I was quite influenced in this regard by Paul Matsuda, who's here. Thanks for coming, Paul. I really appreciate at the Symposium for Second Language Writing, those sessions that happen towards the end, where there's just a chance to kind of ruminate on things that are going on, think about what's happening in the field, and discuss future directions and possibilities. I really find that an interesting, important thing to do. And I thought it would be interesting to reflect on that for the situation in Canada. So I'll try to make my portion of the talk relatively short. And then I'd love to have a little bit of discussion among you all to think through some of the issues that I'll bring up here today. So I absolutely will welcome your thoughts. I'd like to start with a few vignettes that kind of got me thinking about this. I would say that as somebody who was introduced to second language writing, I like to tell people I was introduced to this area by my mentor and my master's advisor, Terry Santos. And I love to tell people that Terry Santos, if you turn to issue 1, volume 1, page 1 of the Journal of Second Language Writing, it's an article by Terry Santos. And it's her thinking about what is second language writing and how does it distinguish itself. So I feel that I come by this, honestly, I've been interested in this for a long time. And also reading work by, at that time in the mid 2000s, by Dwight Atkinson and Paul, really, I think, made me want to think about what is this, how do we do it? And then when I came to Canada about 12 years ago, I started thinking, well, what does this mean in Canada? So here are some interesting vignettes that have got me thinking this way. So I was one of the co-hosts of the Symposium on Second Language Writing in Vancouver. We hosted it, myself and Ling Shi hosted it jointly with UBC and SFU here in Vancouver in 2018. And I thought I'd go back and look at the registrations and see how many Canadians we actually had participate in that symposium. I found, oh, oops, sorry, those are out of order. I probably should start with 2009 because this is where it goes back to. So in 2009, Terry Santos gave a presentation that was a follow-up on a previous historical symposium about second language writing. And she had done a survey of kind of an archaeology or a genealogy of second language writing. And she found the 2 top second language writing PhD supervisors of that time, the 2 who had supervised the most doctoral researchers, were Tony Silva at Purdue and Alistair Cumming at the University of Toronto. And I thought it was really interesting, as someone who had just come to Canada to start my PhD, that one of the main sort of places that produced L2 writing scholars was in Canada. I thought that was exciting and interesting. So then we come to Second Language Writing Symposium in Canada, the first time it's ever hosted here in Canada. And I thought I'd see who were the Canadians in attendance. Only 15% of the non-student, that is staff or faculty or such, only 15% of the attendees were actually from Canada or Canadian universities. And only 11% of the students, which would be sort of the future of researchers in that field, were from Canada. Now, I'm not counting the many great volunteers we had, including some of the people who are here. However, 20% of the student attendees were from Purdue University alone. So I think that shows us how, even though relatively speaking, Canada is less populous country, we might expect to see fewer, proportionally, something seemed a little bit out of whack here. So I thought it would be interesting to explore why that might be. Another vignette that came up is when I was at a job interview some years ago, the job ad, this was in Canada, had mentioned second language writing in the ad itself. It welcomed specialists in a variety of fields, including second language writing. So I gave a presentation that was very geared toward my background in second language writing and the scholars that I drew from and the research I was interested in. And someone from the university responded to me, we don't really do second language writing here. We do academic literacy. And I thought that was quite interesting and telling. And I didn't end up getting that position. Another interesting moment I had was at a conference. I believe it was at the Four Cs. It could have been a different American conference, but I happened to run into several prominent scholars who've been associated with second language writing. And they had a conversation about 2 people, one of whom was myself, another one is someone that I know. And they were just commenting to one another, why can't people like this person and this person, one of whom was me, why can't this person and this person get good positions? And I thought that was quite interesting. Now, thankfully, I have a job that I really like and I think is a good position. But it was interesting to see that, and these scholars were speaking about myself and another person who works in Canada. And all of these things together just made me think, what is it about positioning oneself as a second language writing scholar in Canada? What does that mean here? Does it mean something different than it means in the US? And what are the implications of that for practice, research, theory, all these sorts of things in this context? And that's what I'd like to delve into today. make sure my PowerPoint is working. So what we won't do today, we won't determine whether second language writing is a discipline. There's a very interesting ongoing dialogue. I would encourage you to read the piece from, I don't quite know the pronunciation, Sonis 2020, and then Matsuda 2021, which is just recently came out, I think. Really interesting discussion about disciplinarity and what it means to be a discipline. And I'm very sympathetic to Paul's argument that there is a lack of infrastructure, which I think would suggest that SLW wouldn't be a discipline in that sense. I don't necessarily want to continue that debate or discussion. That's not kind of something I think I know much about. I also don't really want to step into the second language writing versus translingual writing debate, although I think it's a very interesting one, and we're starting to see people talk about it in Canada. We've seen Julia Williams and Frankie Condon talk about it in Tesla Canada in 2016, just after the 2015 kind of article from American scholars trying to clarify the distinction between the two. And we're also seeing some really interesting work by Kristen Taylor, who's here, who I hope will have something to say to us later, who's doing a dissertation that looks at a lot of these issues. I also don't want to decide who is and who is not a second language writing scholar. I think that's up to us, how we want to present ourselves. But I do think what we'll talk about today might look into sort of why we would want to do that and what implications it might have in Canada. So here are some assumptions that I bring to this discussion. One is that second language writing is a specialty or subspecialty of scholars and instructors whose disciplinary and departmental homes vary. This is common around the world, in the US as in Canada. It might be education, might be linguistics, might be English, might be a number of departments or fields. Second language writing is an area of teaching, research, and practice in Canada, second language writing as we might understand it, and it has been for quite some time. Second language writing, the notion of a thing called second language writing, I would argue is primarily centered in the US. And second language writing in Canada is both in a symbiotic relationship with and qualitatively different from second language writing in the US. So those are some of my kind of guiding assumptions. So what is second language writing? Just briefly, you can tell, just as I can always tell that my students have copied and pasted from Wikipedia by the hyperlink still there, this is from Wikipedia. Second language writing is the study of writing performed by non-native speakers / writers of a language as a second or foreign language. Might not be perfect, but this is the definition that's out there. So I would say it is a field of research, it is a skill that is taught, and it is a practice. I think I like to cite Silva's 1993 article as kind of one of the seminal articles, and also because it looks at L2 writing as a thing that people do. So it is a practice. Writing done by second language users is itself a practice. So it's a field of research, it's a skill that's taught, and it's a practice. So the emergence of second language writing in the US, I really appreciate Paul Matsuda's discussion of this disciplinary division of labor from 1999, where he discusses how sort of second language studies, or TESOL in the US, more or less spun off from 4Cs, or sort of more composition focused organizations and pedagogies, right? So we have sort of TESOL, second language studies, applied linguistics on the one hand, spun off from composition studies as kind of the more storied or longer established area. There's a bit of a distinction here, and I've talked about this before, so at some other things I've done, so I won't go too much into this, but we do see a bit of a division here among practitioners, among sort of theoretical orientations, how things are taught, what is taught. I would say at its most basic, and I think this distinction is a little oversimplified, but it still continues today, writing or composition studies tends to have focused on the so-called domestic student or the so-called L1 English student. Applied linguistics, TESOL, and so on tends to have focused on international students, immigrant students, so-called L2 users of English. This tends to have been the divide. Of course, we've seen some interesting cross-pollination between the two as of late. I think the discussions and debates about translingual writing and practice have been very interesting and fruitful, if at times, difficult. But I would say that traditionally in the US, second language writing sort of exists at the nexus of these things. And there are different ways of understanding it. Is it between these? Is it embedded in both of them? Is it interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary? We could discuss those terms, but I think it operates somewhat at the nexus of these things. And we see that in the fact that second language writing exists as kind of a subgroup in both the TESOL Association and groups like the 4Cs, right? So they both consider second language writing to be part of what they do in some sense. In Canada, however, things are a little bit different. And I really appreciate Alistair Cummings' 2016 article, which is based on a an SSLW talk he did when it was in China. I unfortunately missed that one, but I was able to track down the book, special ordered from China, which I got a few weeks ago. And he discusses a different path for the emergence of L2 writing studies in Canada. I think this is really interesting and instructive. Rather than, as in the US, the notion of it spinning off from composition as a response to, say, the increase in international students, Cumming sort of pinpoints the emergence of L2 writing research in Canada as coming from scholars of education and applied linguistics, primarily in the major cities, universities in the major cities in Canada. So Boise, UBC, McGill, universities in Ottawa. And he identifies 3 different waves of this research, primarily coming out of those institutions, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. Taylor, in her upcoming dissertation, argues that there always has been cross-pollination between TESOL and writing in the Canadian context, which is a bit distinct from this notion of the division of labor in the United States. Part of that, and I think this is important, and we just have been talking about this at the Canadian Association for Writing Studies conference a couple of weeks ago, the lack of a disciplinary home and identity for writing in Canada means L2 writing has had more of a home in education and applied linguistics than in a notion of writing or composition studies per se in Canada. Now, there's a lot of discussion to be had about where writing fits in as a discipline anywhere in North America or as a field, and how it's often marginalized and often, I think any of us who work in language-related fields often feel that we aren't taken as seriously as some other areas of research. So we don't have to get into that too much, but I do think it's quite interesting to see that there does appear to have been more of a home in education and applied linguistics rather than kind of a robust writing-centered community. And I think that's really interesting for those of us who want to start with writing. And that's something that I've, probably because of my training, that's something I've always wanted to do. I start with writing. I really like Charles Baserman's article about sort of writing studies as its own discipline. I think writing is so important. I want to start with writing. Okay, so I'm trying to build sort of a picture of second language writing in Canada, and I have a really weird metaphor that probably isn't good. Is second language writing in Canada less a family tree than a creeping lichen? I don't know much about lichen, but I like this image when I came up with it the other day. It's difficult to see a direct sort of archaeology or genealogy of second language writing scholarship and research in Canada than it is in the US. In the US, we can often trace scholars from their supervision at a handful of universities and sort of moving out into other networks where they then go on to supervise other students. Cross-border networks in Canadian and US academia, and there's a great book by Jennifer Clary Lemon and some others about this notion in composition, this notion that US and Canada composition scholars are always coming back and forth. People are hopping the border for PhDs, then coming back, or leaving and getting jobs in the US, or studying in the US, and a variety of sort of cross-border networks, they say. It means that there are some Canadian scholars who present themselves as L2 writing scholars. For example, if you did your doctorate at Arizona State or Purdue, you might present yourself as an L2 writing scholar in Canada, even though there's not as maybe robust of a notion of that field here. I think we probably have some people here today who may be in that camp. For myself, it was studying with Terry Santos at Humboldt State. I was introduced to the field. I was introduced to it in a US context, and I've kind of carried it with me, even though I went on to have my career in Canada. Mid or late career scholars in Canada whose work involves what I would call L2 writing, or who have been involved with organizations like the Journal of Second Language Writing or the Symposium, may position themselves and their students as second language writing scholars, or they may not. And I want to give you a short case study by a colleague of mine who shared a PowerPoint with me recently. I won't mention their name, but this is from a mid-career scholar's presentation, and this is what they put on one slide. EAP, second language writing, academic literacies, CLIL, EMI. I use all of these terms or lenses to describe the same reality in different ways. And this person was actually doing a presentation, collaborative presentation with myself and Ismail recently. And we just sort of discussed, well, you might call it second language writing, I might call it academic literacies, but we're both interested in the same thing here. We come from different backgrounds, different PhD institutions, but in Canada, we're sort of, all of these things are in play. I also wanted to look at Alistair Cumming a little bit as one of the most common, and I throw in this word because I love it, Dr. Vater, the German for PhD supervisor, right, Dr. Father. As one of the 2 most common Dr. Vaters in second language writing, his role has been crucial in sort of continuing to keep the field going in Canada. But will he have academic great-grandchildren? I was very interested in this question, right? So I decided to do a quick genealogy because my own PhD supervisor, and indeed that of several people here, was Dr. Ling Shi at the University of British Columbia. And her supervisor was Alistair. So if we go to Alistair, to Ling, and then to the generation that comes after Ling, we find, I would say through no fault of ours, but through the way that that academia has changed in recent years, we find a group of scholars who may not reproduce. And here's what we have. So this is every PhD graduate who's supervised by Dr. Shi since 2007. And what you'll see here is we have 2 tenure-track professors, both of whom no longer focus their research on L2 writing, although they did for their doctorates. And then each of the other graduates we have in non-tenure track positions, whether they are contract positions, permanent non-research related positions, in some cases staff rather than faculty positions, right? So this is quite interesting, and I think it does have implications for the notion of continuing to support or cultivate a notion that there is something called second language writing that we research in Canada. So it could be that after this generation, there might not be, at least from the UBC side, there might be fewer L2 writing scholars or people who present themselves as L2 writing scholars, which is quite interesting. Now, I know things may be different from other supervisees of Alistair's, and I think some people here may also be his academic grandchildren. So we could discuss that later. So some possible distinctives, and this is where I'd love to get others' suggestions. What are some possible distinctives of L2 writing in Canada, given what we know sort of about the differences that we've seen here and just other things that are going on in the Canadian scene here? One is we may start with a de facto bilingualism rather than a de facto English only standpoint. That's been a big issue for L2 writing scholars in the US, is to sort of push against the notion of English as the only language of writing. But in Canada, of course, ideologically, legally, politically, we start with a de facto bilingualism. Now, that has been a problem. I think Eve Hack's work shows that that can marginalize, both racially and linguistically, marginalize people who aren't associated with either English or French because it's codified in law. However, it also is extremely fruitful for research. So I think of the research that comes out of Ottawa on bilingualism and biliteracy. So we have Jeremy Serrar and Guillaume Gentil doing a large SSHRC-funded project right now on biliteracy, on learning to write in both English and French. I think this is an extremely fruitful area, and I suspect that this is a big distinctive for Canada. Of course, other jurisdictions have this too. I think Hong Kong, of course, has the bilingualism triliteracy policy, but this is an interesting area that Canada can contribute. I think that L2 writing is probably more decentralized and contested. I gave a talk a couple of years ago at CASDW about how what I would call second language writing but is called by other names at different institutions. So some Canadian institutions might look at writing, some might look at communication. I know in Waterloo they refer to a communication requirement for L2 students. We might refer to it as language, or we might refer to it as literacy. And depending on what institution you're at, each institution will have different, I'm going to use this term here, although I don't intend to, different solutions to the so-called issue of L2 students. And I'm sorry to frame it that way, but I think universities often do, unfortunately. Depending on whether an institution sees communication or language or writing as the issue they need to deal with, different scholars will be hired, different theoretical practices will be put in place. And that has implications for those of us who see ourselves as scholars of writing rather than, say, communication. Does L2 writing have a shakier future? As I've discussed there, perhaps it does, although I think we see some signs of life that we might want to talk about later. And then I wonder too if, Cumming argued that there was a lot of focus on immigration to major cities, and that drove a lot of the early L2 writing research in Canada, as opposed to, say, in the US, where you might see, for lack of a better term, more sort of local or non-immigrant populations like Spanish-speaking populations. And perhaps this notion of super diverse cities, which I know has been critiqued of late, but that might be something that is of interest in these large cities, especially in a place like Toronto, that might be driving some of the research and thinking on L2 writing in Canada. So these are sort of my provisional thoughts thus far. I have a few questions that I'd like to throw out there for kind of some discussion, but I also would welcome other people's questions and comments along these lines. So some of the questions that I have are: can second language writing exist in Canada, given the differences from the US context? is the work, oh, there's a typo there, apologies, is the work of establishing second language writing's disciplinarity in Canada needed, right? Or shall we let a thousand flowers bloom, as my colleague's slide showed, a variety of names, different names for the same thing? And where are L2 writing scholars and scholarship in Canada now? Where is the juice? Where is the next generation? Where are we going to see this field develop and flourish, if indeed we do? So thank you so much for listening to some of my ideas here. And I would love to, a few references there if you're interested in some of these. I would love to hear some thoughts, questions. I will turn off my screen share for now. And yeah, let's just have a bit of a discussion. Thanks a lot, everybody.